Hi all, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Communications Director for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our entire staff and our board chairs, Ann Lewis and Todd Richmond, whom I think are with us right now, welcome. We hope you and your loved ones are well and are staying healthy. Under these circumstances, we're thinking of you and your families, and we're grateful to have you here today. If you're interested in what you hear today, I'm going to quickly do a screen share and show you how you can follow along with us. And let's see. There we go. You can please visit our website, sign up through social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at the handle DemMaj, the number 4 Israel. We hope that you will want to connect with us after the event. A couple of housekeeping items, and then I'm going to toss it over to Mark Melman. Everyone will be muted today. The only people not muted are myself and the panelists and Mark. There's no video feature for attendees today, but we will take questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. I'll select some and ask them to the panelists. With that, Mark Melman, our President and CEO, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Let me add my welcome to Rachel's and my best wishes for everyone. You and your family should all remain safe and healthy in this difficult time. As everyone on this call knows, for the last year, Israel has been by a political paralysis, which very recently seems to have been broken. We're really privileged to have 2 of the most important voices in Israel on with us today to tell us what's happening and what it portends for the future. It's a pleasure to introduce both of them to you. They'll speak for a few minutes, and then Rachel will engage in a dialogue back and forth, then we'll go over to your questions. But our first speaker is going to be Lahav. Lahav is now the senior contributing editor and the diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. Prior to that, she served for 8 years as the Knesset correspondent for the Post. So she's really in a unique position to bring together the domestic politics and the foreign policy of Israel. She's also originally from New Jersey, has been in Israel since she was 17, and was recently called one of the 5 most important people on Jewish Twitter. So we were very grateful to have her. Also with us is Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, where with an American imam, he runs a program on Jewish, Muslim, Christian cooperation, and is also best-selling and award-winning author, most recently of Letters to My Palestinian. So we are, again, delighted to have both of these outstanding voices from Israel to help us understand what's going on and what it portends. Let's turn first to Lahav and then to
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me come speak. So I think you guys are such an important group doing such an important thing, so I'm really glad to be here. Right now, as we speak, there are coalition negotiations happening. While Mark was speaking, I got a message about it. So right now, the Likud team and the blue and white team are doing exactly or similar to what we are doing. They are negotiating over Zoom or maybe Skype, I don't know, over video though. And hopefully we'll have some kind of government soon. So I'm gonna rewind a little bit to less than a week ago when it suddenly became clear that Israel was moving towards some kind of government. Of course, you never know what'll happen in the end, but it looks like we're moving towards some kind of government. What happened was there was a long controversy that I'm not going to get into right now about the Speaker of the Knesset and who was going to be the next Speaker of the Knesset. And suddenly, Benny Gans, the leader of the Blue and White Party, threw his hat into the ring. And he ended up being the only official candidate for Knesset Speaker. And it looked very strange that someone who is the candidate for Prime Minister, and legally he is the person right now who is tasked with forming the next government and being the next Prime Minister, says, oh, I'm run for Knesset now. But really what he was doing was, because there was a controversy over who would be Knesset Speaker, he put himself in there as a placeholder in order to allow negotiations to continue for a government that would include Blue and White and Likud, and there wouldn't be someone else being Knesset speaker that was controversial. So that was the point at which people realized, if Gans is doing this, that the negotiations for a unity government, which, in Israel means sort of a government that includes parties on both sides of the aisle, is probably going to happen. Now, the negotiations are occurring on lines that were sort of set by President Rivlin. Rivlin suggested these sort of terms in September in hopes that there would be a unity government at that point. As we know, it didn't happen, and we had a third election in less than a year. And apparently it took a plague in order to get the sides to come together. But they're using Rivlin's suggestion. So the first part of the suggestion is because Netanyahu insists on keeping the entire right wing together, so all of the parties that support him, he doesn't want to sort of abandon any of his allies, and so he insists on keeping that bloc together. So Rivlin suggested that it be what they're calling a parity government. Parity, Parity, not parody like mocking something. But it's also just funny because it's not. Yeah, it's also just funny because it's not really a word that Israelis usually use, and suddenly you hear it all the time in the news. They say pariteti, and it's like people have to look it up in the dictionary, So in any case, what they mean by parity government is that the seats in the cabinet would be divided half to the right wing and the other half to blue and white. It might end up being blue and white and Labor, but Labor only has 3 seats at this point. So it means that Labor will have blue and white will have a disproportionate amount of seats in the next cabinet. They will have half or almost half of the seats, blue and white alone, whereas the other half will be divided among the several right-wing parties. So it means Likud will probably only have a quarter of the cabinet seats. The other thing is that it's a rotation government. So that means that, for those who are familiar with Israeli politics of the 80s, they've made a comeback, and we'll have a year and a half of Netanyahu, and then another year and a half of Gans, and then at that point, maybe an election, maybe Gans will continue. It's not clear yet what would happen if they manage to survive past 3 years, but not so many Israeli governments do. So that's what they're negotiating right now. Now, Netanyahu will be prime minister first for there to be continuity, and also because of his complex legal situation, we don't know where he's going to be in a year and a half, although judging by Israel's justice system in general, there probably won't be a verdict in a year and a half. But in any case, Netanyahu will be prime minister in the beginning, and Gantz will probably be defense minister for that time. In a year and a half, when Gantz will become prime minister, theoretically again, if this all happens, then Netanyahu is not going to be defense minister because there's a law in Israel that you can't be a minister under indictment, but you can be prime minister under indictment. There's an exception made for prime minister. And this was not in a time when people necessarily thought it was going to be applied to Netanyahu. So it's not like some sort of special law for him. But there is an exception for prime minister, and the logic is so that you can't have sort of one branch of government overthrowing the head of the other branch of government. You can't even have something that looks like that. So Netanyahu will be in this like weird limbo situation, right, where he had been prime minister for a year and a half, and then suddenly he can't even be a minister. So they're going to pass some kind of law to allow him to be sort of a deputy prime minister, and to add deputy prime minister as an exemption so that he can continue to serve. And one of the things that they're considering to having him do is to have him be responsible for Israel's foreign relations, specifically with the major world powers, so specifically with US, Russia, probably China, EU, but certainly the US is a big one. I mean, depends on who wins in November, right? The attractiveness of that for Netanyahu. But if Netanyahu thinks Trump will be elected, then that's certainly a good job for him because they get along. That's one of the things being discussed. In many ways, that will weaken Gantz. I mean, that's a huge part of the prime minister's role. It's usually the prime minister and not the foreign minister who's in charge of relations with the US and sometimes with other major countries. And there's a lot of other things that it's not so clear that Gantz is taking strong positions in the negotiations. So, for example, Gantz has insisted that the justice minister be from blue and white and not be someone who is a Netanyahu ally. But Likud insists that they have final approval on who Gans chooses as justice minister. And so that's right now is one of the sticking points in the negotiations. And there's several other things. For example, this is supposed to be the coronavirus emergency government. And there's a lot of criticism of the current health minister, Yaakov Litzman, coming from Blue and White even, that he's not so involved himself in how this is being handled. He's also been investigated for helping a Haredi pedophile basically get out of going to trial. He pressured psychologists to it's a long story, I'm not going to get into it, but people are saying to Gans, like, how can you let this person stay if you are an anti-corruption party? That was a huge part of their campaign. So there's certain controversies, and there's certain things that are still being debated, and so the coalition talks are not over yet. Another major thing that's being debated is, the Trump peace plan includes annexation of the settlements, and Netanyahu has repeatedly promised to his voters and to his base that he's going to annex the settlements. And Gantz sort of, when the Trump plan came out, he said, oh, this is a very good plan, but he hedged it with, we can't take action unless our neighbors, unless Egypt support it. And because Egypt and Jordan still don't support settlement annexation, he wants veto power over that. So that's another thing that's being debated in the coalition talks, I think is a major point.
Thank you. Yossi.
Okay. Well, Lahav, thank you. And Mark, Rachel, thank you for having me. And thank you for really the fantastic work you're doing. Deeply appreciated. So I'd like to speak as a centrist, as somebody who has waited many years for the emergence of a strong center that would be capable of challenging the right, not from the left, but from the center. And we finally reached that moment this year. The center managed to hold its ground through 3 rounds of elections. And then, seemingly inexplicably, we wake up the news that Gans has decided to destroy the center's greatest chance for governance and to enter into a unity government. And I have to tell you that I felt 2 overwhelming emotions when I heard this. First was relief that we are now going to have a functioning government. And the second was profound sadness that once again the center has seemingly self-destructed. So the question that so many of us have been asking ourselves over the last week is, who is Gans? Why did he do this? And it seems to me that the answer boils down to 3 options. Gans is either a fool, whom Netanyahu has simply wrapped around his finger. He's naive. He's a scoundrel who has decided to throw his lot in with his mortal enemy in exchange for a shot at the prime ministership. Or option number 3, he is a patriot, a soldier. He has possibly sacrificed his political career for the good of the country. I believe that it's mostly option number 3 with a bit of option number 1 thrown in, which worries me about the fate of these negotiations, if he's up to really getting the best possible deal from Netanyahu. But I think that it's also important to go back to what you were saying, Lahav, to go back to a week and a half ago and to really understand the crisis that we were in. Israel found itself in the worst crisis of democratic legitimacy that we had been in since the 90s, since the Oslo years that led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And the crisis that we found ourselves in last week was a convergence of 2 crises of democratic legitimacy. The first was, as Lahav indicated, a very complicated dance a struggle for power, for authority between the Supreme Court and Knesset. This has been going on for many years, but it reached its culmination last week when the Supreme Court ordered the Likud Speaker of the House to convene Parliament. He refused. He shut down the Knesset, and so we were really in a crisis of legitimacy. And the second crisis that we found ourselves in was a situation where both left and right, or center and right, were accusing each other of threatening one of Israel's two most basic identities, either Israel as a Jewish state or Israel as a democratic state. The right was accusing the center of threatening the Jewishness of the state by forming a narrow government with the Arab list. The Arab list is especially detested, not only on the right, I'd say fairly widely among Jewish Israelis, because many of its supporters have expressed their support for terrorism. Some of its Knesset members have. And the party is opposed to Israel's very identity, Jewish state. And so this was seen by the right as an act of betrayal. The fact that Gans was prepared to create a narrow government that would depend on the Arab list. For its part, center saw Netanyahu's denial of the right of Arab voters to help determine the outcome of the election as a profound blow against Israeli democracy, against Israel's identity as a democracy. And Netanyahu said at one point that he won the election because he won a majority of Jewish votes, which meant that for Netanyahu, the Arab votes didn't count. And so we found ourselves in these multiple crises of legitimacy. We found ourselves in the worst schism that this country has been in for many years, where left and right, left, center, and right suddenly saw each other as threatening a elemental aspects of Israeli identity. And so I think that Gantz realized this crisis had to be diffused. You can't have a crisis over Israel's fundamental identity in the middle of a pandemic. And so Gantz did really, I think, what needed to be done. I should also say that I'm relieved that Yair Lapid is remaining in opposition, that even though the center is now substantially weakened, there will be nevertheless a strong centrist voice outside of government to challenge this bizarre but necessary coalition. One or two last points. The first concerns the future of the Jewish-Israeli, Arab-Israeli relationship. While it's true that this turned out not to be an opportune moment to test the taboo over bringing the Arab list into some form of relationship with the coalition. And the Arab list, by the way, would not have been part of the government, it would have supported the government. But I think that what's significant about this moment is that it broke a psychological taboo. And for the first time, it suddenly became possible to imagine a situation where we have an Arab party as having some relationship with the coalition. Now, there are many, many problems with that arrangement. What would happen if we needed to go to war with Gaza or with Iranian bases in Syria or with Hezbollah? The Arab party would simply pull out its support. So you can't really have a stable government under the conditions that we live in with a dependence on the Arab list. Nevertheless, we suddenly had this tantalizing glimpse into a possible Israel where Arabs and Jews could somehow cooperate politically and create a different kind of government. The last point concerns Gans. I believe that Gans has two very crucial goals here, two crucial missions. First is to save the justice system, take it out of the hands of its current Likud justice minister, who I would call an anti-justice minister, someone who has declared war against the legitimacy of the justice system, and bring it back into the hands of that part of Israeli society that believes that maintaining the credibility of the courts, of the media, however flawed these institutions are human institutions and are flawed. Nevertheless, you don't challenge the legitimacy of these institutions. That's the only court we have, and it's the only media we have. Finally, I think that Gans's challenge will be to try to prevent any annexation from happening in any part of the West.
Thanks, Yossi. I'm going to ask you more about that, the last point you made, in a little bit, but following some of the questions that we have coming in, and there's several of them about Gans, and there's one from our board member, Sam Lauder. We're happy to have him on the call, that a few others have also asked, and we'd like your take on whether or not you think Gans would really become prime minister. Many people are saying it's naive to believe that that would really happen. Lahav, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I understand why people think it's naive, and they're not wrong to think that. The other parties on the right have sought to give Gans assurances that they wouldn't allow it to happen, because the only way Netanyahu could remain prime minister is if he got a majority of the Knesset to support him as prime minister, or if he got a majority of the Knesset to support calling an election in a year and a half. So other parties on the right have said to Gans, if there's a unity government, we'll even sign a paper that says that we will make sure that Netanyahu follows through on his word. So for the people who don't trust Netanyahu, they'll have to trust Naftali Bennett and Aryeh Deri and Yaakov Litzman, which I see Yossi laughing. So, but it's more people, at least. It's not just Netanyahu. So there's that. But it is a real question, because this is a government that in theory is being formed because there's this emergency going on, and please God, we won't have such an emergency in a year and a half, and will it really last that long under these terms? It's hard to say.
Okay, good. So another question, unless Yossi wanted to add anything there. Okay, good. Are there serious contradictions within the emerging governing coalition? And if so, what are some of the sticking points? Yossi, want to take that one, please?
Well, there are, the tragedy of Israeli politics in the last year has been the opening of an existential divide between those who believe that Israeli democracy needs to be defended almost at any cost, and those whose commitment to Israeli democracy is increasingly tentative. Now, the tragedy here is that until very recently, we had a virtual consensus over Israel as being both a Jewish state and a democratic state, and that democracy wasn't only a technical means of how we elect government; it was also a value. Being a democratic state was as essential to Israeli identity as being a Jewish state. And Netanyahu has placed an enormous question mark over that shared assumption, and has radicalized a large part of the Israeli public. He has brought in anti-democratic ideas that were once on the periphery of Israeli society, and legitimized those ideas and brought them into the heart of the public debate. The moment that the Prime Minister of Israel says, I should be the Prime Minister because I want a majority of Jewish votes, that is a declaration of war against Israel. So the greatest tension in this government, something that shouldn't have been an issue at all, which is taking for granted our two non-negotiable identities. Israel is a Jewish state and Israel is a democratic state. But we now have a coalition that is torn between this most fundamental question.
Question from Laura Lauder. Laura asks, please clarify the annexation of the Jordan Valley issues again, as your audio cut out. Is Gans trying to get Jordan to support it before agreeing?
Sure. So the Trump plan allows for more than annexing the Jordan Valley. It would allow Israel to apply its laws to 30% of the West Bank, which would include all of the Israeli communities in that area, not just the Jordan Valley, and land beyond that. So, and then the other 70% would be a Palestinian state, a demilitarized Palestinian state. Gans basically is not really in favor of unilateral annexation. He has said specifically about the Jordan Valley that the Jordan Valley would be part of Israel forever and that Israel needs it for its security. And a very large swath of the Knesset, from the right to the moderate left, I would say, agree that the Jordan Valley should remain part of Israel. But Gans never really specified how that would happen, whether that would mean annexation, whether that would mean continuing the current situation. And then when the Trump plan came along and he had to be a little bit more specific, then he said that you need support from Israel's neighbors and he wouldn't want to do something that would alienate Jordan or Egypt. He's not prime minister, so he's not actively trying to rally anyone for this. But if it gets to the point where, and Trump is still president and says, he wants to see Israel make some movement on that plan, it'll be a big question for that next government and what they're going to do.
So if I could just jump in for a moment. I agree with you, Lahav, that there is a broad consensus about retaining the Jordan Valley in some fashion. The broadest consensus focuses on retaining security control. There is no broad consensus on annexation for sure. There isn't even a broad consensus on retaining the settlements in the Jordan Valley. So where Netanyahu and his coalition partners want to go is very much not where I think center would go.
Just to add one more thing, there are certain areas, like if you're going to divide up the West Bank, and when you ask more specific questions, there are certain areas where a vast majority of Israelis think that Israel should remain and Israelis should continue to live, especially Ma'ale Adumim. There's polls showing that 3/4 of Israelis think that Israel should retain Ma'ale Adumim, which is the biggest settlement.
7 minutes away from where I'm sitting now, just down the road.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a little bit about how the emerging government will intersect with the political situation in the United States. Of course, there will be an election here in November. Well, first I wanted to ask is, do you think this new emerging government will be in tune or out of tune with the Trump administration? And if there is, say, for example, President Biden elected in January 2021, disclosure, DMFI-PAC has endorsed Vice President Biden's candidacy. How do you think that, what impact do you think that may have?
Alf, do you want to take it?
Sure. I think that if President Trump is reelected, that things will continue much as it has thus far. I don't think that no government wants to go head to head with any U.S. president, even though it has happened. No Israeli government, I mean. But I think that, Trump, when it comes to action with Israel, he consults with Israel first. He doesn't announce things or hasn't really put a lot of pressure on Israel to do things Israel doesn't want. And I imagine that would continue, although he would like to show some sort of victory from his peace plan. I don't think he wants it to just remain on paper. And so Israel will have to work out what they can do, right, politically, because we just talked about annexation, whether that's possible or not. When it comes to President Biden, I actually think it'll probably be fine as well. I think, again, that the goal is not going to be on a collision course with President Biden, and it's obvious that the Trump peace plan won't be on the table anymore. And, the things that Netanyahu clashed with President Obama about, for example, really about, it was to some extent about settlements, but it wasn't Netanyahu didn't take as drastic a step or as major a step as annexing anything. And so I think that even Netanyahu understands that, you know, the only support Israel has for annexation is from President Trump. And if there's a different president, then is not going to work anymore. I've also covered, I mean, this will be my fourth Netanyahu government that I'm covering, and it will be the third one out of those four in which there's a centrist party that's sort of pulling the government into the center. And it's usually significant. Usually when there's a centrist or even a moderate left-wing party in the Netanyahu coalition, they often block moves like that. Now, when you get into the more granular level of who's probably going to be in this coalition, Netanyahu might have a narrow majority of people who support things like settlement annexation. He might be able to pass it without Gans, but that also means that then his whole government will fall apart. So these are a lot of considerations, and I don't think that he'll take that action. He'll be able to politically take that action if there's no support for the U.S.
And the only thing I would add to that is Iran, and if it's President Biden, and if Biden is committed to restoring the deal, there will be serious tension between Israel and the White House.
Right, and I think that tension will, you know, I think those are things that Gans would disagree with as well. I think most of the major security figures in Israel, you know, were not supportive of the Iran deal. Although once it was signed, they sort of had different ideas of how to handle it.
Right.
Okay, a question from Jay Sokolov. Is the role of religious parties weakened or strengthened by this emerging coalition? Jump ball.
Well, you know, I'm actually thinking in Corona terms at the moment. I'm wondering how the ultra-Orthodox community is going to come out of this. Something like half of the hospitalized cases, is that right, Lahav? Half are ultra-Orthodox in Israel. We see nightly scenes, appalling scenes of ultra-Orthodox violating the restrictions. True, it's happening increasingly on the fringes, but up until a week or so ago, this was happening within the mainstream of the ultra-Orthodox world. And so I think that they have lost an enormous amount of standing. And in Israel, it's true that coalition politics and maneuvering determines quite a lot, but I don't think it determines everything. And I have a sense that Avigdor Lieberman, who has been written off as the great loser in this emerging new coalition, because he's the one who really stayed out of the right wing. He pulled himself out of the right wing bloc to try to topple Netanyahu, and now he finds himself out in the cold. The fact that he is maintaining a principled opposition to ultra-Orthodox power might resonate very strongly with larger parts of the Israeli electorate. I think there's a tremendous amount of anger and frustration today, the ultra-Orthodox notion of having a separatist world within the Jewish state.
Yeah, I would just add, if we're talking about sheer numbers, for sure they're weakened in this government, or in what will probably be this government. But the advantage, the political advantage that the Haredim have is that they have a few things that they care about, and then they're extremely loyal and will go with whatever the government wants on everything else. And they use that in order to get what they want on those few things that they care about. And I don't think that this government's going to be any different, because I think that both Gans and Netanyahu will look at them and say, well, if we want to be prime minister again in the future and not in a unity government, we're going to need them.
We talked about annexation a little bit. Yossi, I wanted to ask you something that you wrote about the peace process you wrote between Israelis and Palestinians You wrote, the only solution is that each side accepts the fact that we're going to have to perform a kind of amputation on ourselves. What do you mean? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways in which a centrist sensibility differs from a left-wing position is that for me, my starting point is no different than the right. Between the river and the sea, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, it is all the land of Israel. It all belongs to me. And I have no squeamishness in saying that. That is simply a normative reading of Jewish history and of Jewish identity. The problem is that there's another people between the river and the sea that also makes the same claim, that all of that land belongs to them. I am not particularly concerned about their maximalist claim because my claim is also maximalist. And so I think we need to free ourselves of the illusions, the wishful thinking, the Oslo years, which was that each side really wants to compromise, and the West Bank belongs to the Palestinians, and pre-67 belongs to Israel, and we just have to figure out the technicalities. The reason that peace keeps eluding us is because both sides deeply, genuinely, and from each side's perspective, legitimately believes that all of the land belongs to them. But that's my starting point, not my end point. My end point is that I will have to give up something that belongs to me. And I'm saying give up and not give back. Crucial difference between how a centrist would phrase it and a left-winger would phrase it. I'm not giving back something because I'm giving up land that belongs to me. In the same way, the Palestinians, from their perspective, will have to give up land that belongs to them, which is what we call the state of Israel. And if we come to that point, which is a very realistic reading of how each people truly sees justice, then it means really partitioning not just the land, but partitioning each side's sense of justice.
Thank you. Great. Okay, here's a question from our board co-chair, Todd Richmond, going back to the emerging government. Will there be any major Israeli policy changes by having Gans in a unity government, both domestically and internationally?
Well, it's an interesting question because he's campaigned for things that would be major changes, but the blue and white campaign and the party that was blue and white was very heavily influenced by Yair Lapid and his Yesh Atid party. Their platform was, barely different from what the Yesh Atid form was. And that made sense because Yesh Atid was, when it comes to centrist parties in Israel, they tend to not survive more than 2 or 3 election cycles. And so Yesh Atid was, the older centrist party, having been around since 2013. And Gans was completely new to politics. And so, but now Lapid is out and his Yesh Atid party is out and we're left with just Gans. And we have to learn who Gans really is. And you might think that someone who ran in 3 election cycles, we'd know exactly who he is. But a lot of his campaign strategy was based on him not being able to be pinned down in a lot of ways. In the first election, he avoided being interviewed and for a very long time. And it's not to say that Netanyahu is better, right? But Netanyahu does not give a lot of interviews, but we usually know where he stands. And so it's hard to separate Gans from the Lapid of the positions. So we can only look at the campaign, right? And they want, and look at the negotiations and what they're pushing for. So in the negotiations, the thing that he seems to be pushing most for is for the Likud to have much less of an influence when it comes to the legal system. The one thing he had insisted on, and sort of people within the campaign and within the coalition talk said that this is something that Gantz himself felt strongly about, is that he didn't want to be in a coalition with Netanyahu because Netanyahu was under indictment on corruption charges. And he didn't think that, even if the law allows it, he didn't think it was right for somebody prime minister when they're, indicted for corruption. So at this point, he felt that, it's an emergency and he needs to back down, but he so far is not backing down on the Justice Ministry. So there might be some kind of change in that. In the last government, so over the last 5 years, we've had justice ministers that were pushing back against judicial activism and doing things to get more conservative judges on the bench. Now, the system is very different from the US. It's not like the right has a majority in the Knesset, and so the right can nominate all right-wing judges. There's a committee, and half of the committee or most of the committee is made up of the Bar Association and the judges. And the way they managed to get conservative judges was that a conservative chairman of the Bar Association was elected. So them together with the politicians elected them. But if you have, let's say there's still a conservative chairman of the Bar Association, the judges overall tend not to be conservative. There's not that many conservative judges. And then if the politicians are not conservative either, then you're going to change again the courts. And that changes again this whole battle that Yossi had referred to about the role of the judiciary in Israel. It's a little wonky though, right? It's people who care a lot about politics and care about these issues care about it. I think the average Israeli doesn't care about that at all. And actually on a lot of the things that the average Israeli cares about, there's not, economic things, it's not a huge debate. There is a pretty big debate on religion and state, and Gans did campaign on a very secularist campaign and lowering the influence of Haredim, but it doesn't look like he'll be able to act on that. In the way this government is coming together.
Thank you. And I think this will be, I'm looking at the time, I think this will be our final question, Yossi, to you from Brian Burke in Pittsburgh. You speak about the broad Israeli political center and how you have voted for centrist parties for many years. What does the breakup of the Blue and White Alliance mean for the future of the Israeli center? Why do many of these centrist parties or alliances only last for a few election cycles, when it seems that many Israelis fall broadly into a political camp that is seemingly centrist, more center-right on security issues, but maybe more center-left on social issues?
One of the structural flaws of the center has been an inability to clearly define itself. Centrists tend to know what they oppose. We don't have a clear centrist position, for example, on a Palestinian state. And my sense is, and maybe this is wishful thinking, that the position that I have is shared by the center, which is that in principle, I am ready for the painful concessions to create a two-state solution, but only under certain circumstances, and we are nowhere near those circumstances today. So but I don't hear a clear voice. Now, Yair Lapid actually had a terrific essay in last weekend's Haaretz. I don't know if it was translated into English, but I urge people to look it up if it was. And he, for the first time, I felt here was somebody really articulating this political moment through a very clear ideological centrist lens. He was focusing specifically on Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state, and why those two elements of our identity are each non-negotiable. But it was the most memorable political essay that I've seen from any Israeli politician. Now, admittedly, the competition is not fierce. We don't have great political thinkers here. I don't know if you have great political thinkers anymore in the States either. But I was deeply impressed with Yair Lapid's vision and his ability to articulate it. So I think that if we are going to see the reemergence of a center after this shattering, it's going to have to be on a very clear ideological basis. Israelis are going to have to understand, what do you stand for? And it's not enough to say, we rak lo Bibi, as we said in Hebrew, just, anyone but Bibi. That's not enough of a campaign. Because in the end, when you realize that you have a corona emergency and, well, you have to make a deal with Bibi, then suddenly the whole foundation of your party falls apart. So what is the center? What do we stand for on a whole range of issues? That's the challenge that we face. And I see this crisis as an opportunity to, for the first time, truly conceptualize the centrist alternative to both the right and the left.
Thank you so much to you both. Yossi Klein Halevi is the best-selling author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. He's a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Lahav Harkov is the senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. We're grateful to have you today. We hope that everybody stays safe and well. As I conclude, I'm going to put up on screen how to connect with us one more time, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Again, please stay safe and stay well. Thank you all.
Thank you.